Wonderful. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Jennifer Ponce de León. I'm the Associate Director of the Critical Theory Workshop, and I'm also an Associate Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm really thrilled today to be moderating this event about Immanuel Ness's new book, which we have here, Migration as Economic Imperialism. And we have with us Immanuel Ness and Raúl Delgado Wise. Before introducing them, I just wanted to say a few things about the Critical Theory Workshop. We're going to be sharing in the chat our website so you can see more information about our various activities. We host these various public events online and sometimes in person throughout the year. We also have organize a summer school, which I co-direct with Gabriel Rockhill. And that's going to be held online this year, featuring Marxist scholars from around the world. We'll be sharing information about that in the chat. We also are just launched a new book series that Emmanuel and I and Gabriel Rockhill are all co-editing, called Anti-Imperialist Marxism, which is a new book series with Iskra Books. And we'll share some information about that. We're really eager for submissions to that series. And the first book in that series is recently out. We also have a new journal, the World Marxist Review, and that we're affiliated with. Its first issue just came out, and we'll share information about that as well as a link if you're interested in donating. So now to get on to our main event. First, so Emanuel Ness is professor of political science at Brooklyn College at the City University of New York. He's also visiting professor of sociology at the University of Johannesburg. He is co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Labor and Society. And in addition to this latest book, Dr. Ness is the author of Southern Insurgency, The Coming of the Global Working Class, Organizing Insurgency, Workers' Movements in the Global South, and Ours to Master and to Own, Workers' Control from the Commune to the Present. He has edited many collections. Some of these include the Routledge Handbook of the Gig Economy, the Oxford Handbook of Economic Imperialism, Sanctions as War, Anti-Imperialist Perspectives on American Geoeconomic Strategy, Choke Points, Logistic Workers Disrupting the Global Supply Chain, and Global Rupture, Neoliberal Capitalism and the Rise of Informal Labor in the Global South. Now, Raúl Delgado Wise is professor and director of the doctoral program in development studies at the Autonomous University of Zacatecas. He is the president and co-founder of the International Network on Migration and Development, co-director of the Critical Development Studies Network, editor of the journal Migración y Desarrollo, and UNESCO Chair on Migration, Development, and Human Rights. He has an incredible corpus of work. He is the author or editor of, I think, 31 books and more than 300 book chapters and refereed articles. Of these many books include Mexico's Economic Dilemma, The Development Failures of Neoliberalism, co-written with James Seifer, Agrarian Change, Migration and Development with Henry Veltmeyer, and La Migración Mexicana Altamente Calificada del cara al siglo XXI, Problemáticas y Desafíos. I am really honored to have Raúl and Emmanuel here with us today. So first, Manny's going to be speaking about the book, then Raúl's going to offer a response. We'll have an opportunity for them to discuss together, and then we'll open it up to questions from our audience. So I'll turn it over to you, Manny.
Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the invitation from the Critical Theory Workshop, and I look forward to working with the Critical Theory Workshop in the years to come. They really have a wonderful lineup of books and their annual book series and journals and so forth, and their annual conference, I know, in Paris is outstanding, which I hope to go to soon. And I would also like to thank Jennifer personally for inviting me to this discussion, as well as Gabriel for doing so. So last, I'd like to say that I'm honored to be in discussion with Raul, who is a person who I find as a mentor in some respects, even though I don't know him well. I've read many of the books that you mentioned and have been inspired by his work throughout my entire academic life. So I just want to say thank you for that. So this book, Migration as Economic Imperialism, began as a project that sought to debunk many of the perspectives that are advanced by the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, multilateral lending agencies, finance capital, as well as most of the migration scholars who study labor migration in particular. So the point was not to say you're wrong, I'm right, or we're right, and so forth, but it was actually to analyze in a very critical way the forms of migration that take place rooted in labor mobility between countries and to some degree inside countries, and to analyze how much they benefit the world, but in particular, how much they benefit the origin countries. And those origin countries are southern countries. By that, I mean countries in the third world or the global south. And they are the primary source of most of the migrants, but ironically, most of the exchange of money occurs between rich countries. So it's more likely that money will be exchanged between France, Britain, and the United States, Japan, etc., than they will between countries such as Nepal and Britain and so forth, or Central American countries like El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, and the US, and so forth. So while the vast majority of migrants come from the global south, migrant workers, they represent uh, uh, not a vast, but a smaller form, a smaller amount of exchange. So I root this work in the notion that migration, should be a good thing. I'm fully, and I think we all are, supportive of mobility between countries, especially amongst those people who are in the global south. People should have the right to cross borders and so forth and to do what they wish. However, the purpose of migration over the last 30 years has been as a mechanism to advance countries in the North, rich countries such as the United States and Western Europe, parts of East Asia, and also the Gulf countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council in West Asia, and southeastern countries to some degree like Malaysia. And in this context, uh, most of the migration has taken the form of one of two forms in this case. One would be migration on the basis of undocumented labor, which is absolutely necessary. A second would be bilateral agreements between countries to migrate. So in this context, there would be temporary migration programs in which people would be permitted to stay for a designated period of time and then forced to return after a specific time when they complete their jobs or something like that. Well, there have been a lot of issues with respect to violations and so forth, but I was focused on the latter of the two because the first is obviously an example of how the US system in particular does not work, and how the United States addresses the question of migration. I consider undocumentation as a form of migration, as a regime of migration. So we can have undocumented migration, which is what the United States wants. At least that's what it seems to be over the last 40 years or so. And we can also have temporary migration programs. The idea of having a global system of migration, while it has been approved, virtually no countries have engaged in it. And that has been the leader behind this has been the United States and some central and some central European countries and so forth. One other country. So I would like to make the case that in this book, I'm saying that you have these undocumented migrants, and they are absolutely necessary and integral for the economies of the global North. So when the United States claims that, well, we have too many undocumented migrants, well, in fact, that's what they want. They do not want migrants that have status in one way or another. They don't want migrants who are uh, going to be subject to laws that ensure wages and housing and healthcare, etc. Whereas you have another regime in which you have temporary migration, which seems to be the growing form of migration, and maybe the kind of migration that the United States, certain elements in the United States prefer, especially for high wage workers, that is becoming the most important form of migration. And within this context, the argument has always been, and this is also for undocumented migration, that the beneficiaries of migration are those people who migrate, that those workers who come from Nepal and go to Malaysia, perhaps, which is one of the major corridors, it's the Nepalese rural migrants who are the beneficiaries. And Nepal as a whole benefits as a consequence of having its youngest men and women migrate to Malaysia and Gulf countries and beyond. And that as a consequence, Nepal will develop extensively through this process. Well, that hasn't happened based on the data, based on my research in both places, especially with respect to Nepal, where you have an extremely poor country where the major industry, in fact, is migration. So essentially, just like the Philippines, you have a country that is dependent on migration. And this form of dependency is one that is highly corrosive toward the government or toward the people, I would say, of Nepal. So I would start, straight away by saying that migration primarily benefits those rich countries who are recipients of migration, as well as finance capital, which invests in various kinds of installations, factories, and so forth, and so on, to have migrants go there and to engage in work in one way or another. So this countervails the dominant perspective that migration is a benefit to countries that are poor around the world, which make up 90% of the population. And that it does lend credibility to a whole host of perspectives that may be uncomfortable to a lot of people. The idea that some workers or most workers in rich countries are an aristocracy of labor, in the sense that they are beneficiaries of migration. When we think of the COVID-19 pandemic, it was migrant workers in the United States and throughout the world who took the risks of working, who were involved in healthcare, who were involved in emergency care, etc. Yet they received none of the benefits that they were actually providing. Um, and so that's just one example. One can give numerous examples of the benefits. So for instance, there are five major areas of migration that exist, and each of them are very low wage migration forms. The first being agriculture historically. The second would be construction. The third would be manufacturing. The fourth would be care work, which is extremely important and involves women primarily. And the fifth, which is relatively new, would be the platform or gig economy, where you find a growing number of migrants in the global north who are engaged in the kind of delivery, ride hailing, and so forth that make major cities operate, without which they would not be able to function to a large extent. And it also increases profitability to a great extent. So I look at, three major areas. One is the economic consequences for countries of origin. Again, all throughout the world, I can give specific examples. And I find that in most instances, economically, the countries are in decline as a consequence of migration. Well, I'll just give one example. For instance, if we look at Pakistan as a very large country with about 200 million people, they have many migrants that travel throughout the world. And of course, they earn foreign exchange and they send money home and so forth. But they don't really do much more than maybe help their family members. And we also have, for instance, Indonesian workers in Hong Kong, and in fact, and Filipino workers as well, and each are engaged in care work, and there's about 600,000 care workers in maybe 700,000 in Hong Kong, which is something like one per four families. And well, yes, they may earn some decent wages, far more than skilled workers in Indonesia or the Philippines. However, they do so for a very limited period of time, and they also do very little more than perhaps pay for um, a wedding or maybe help out their families or something like that. And during those periods of time that they're engaged in care work, they're highly exploited throughout the day. Now, most of the care work does not go on in the global south, although Hong Kong is one of the richest cities in the world. It goes on in the global north, where significant percentages of the population are migrant workers who are on temporary contracts and must go home upon the completion of those contracts. So if we take a look at Europe, we're looking at 15 to 20% of populations that are migrant workers. Some of them are temporary, some of them are permanent, but for the most part, they are highly necessary for the countries to survive. They provide care work, they provide many different types of services. But back home in the countries of origin, whether it's Guatemala, whether it's Malawi, which they generally don't go to the global north, whether it's Nepal, whether it's Moldova in southeastern Europe, uh, and so forth and so on, these countries benefit very, very marginally. If anything, I would make a very strong case that these countries suffer a huge level of decline, economic decline, dependency, underdevelopment as a consequence of this. So when you have the youngest who tend to migrate most, when you have the most educated that frequently migrate as well, the countries that are countries of origin decline, even if it is true that some money does go back through remittances. Now, the World Bank and Nomad and all these organizations Nomad is their migration unit, will argue strenuously that migration creates a lot of remittances and so forth, and those remittances contribute to development. Well, I have really seen no example of a sustained form of remittances. Of course, there have been cases where people like to say, well, here is a project where a certain percentage of the money will be also given to the state and so forth and so on, like in Mexico, but it doesn't do anything, a smidgen, in terms of development. So I'm making that case strongly. This book is really about the question of economic development. It's a book about development more than it is really about migration. And in that sense, I'm arguing that remittances are the most recent form of development that the Western banks and economists have come up with as a form of advancing poor countries. I mean, some of the cases get even more bizarre, which I discuss in the book with respect to social remittances, where in fact the argument, people are serious about this, leading scholars, that because migrants go to countries in the North, Europe, North America, etc., that consequently they will learn new forms of cultural values that will help them and transform the societies of origin in a positive way, like new clothing. I can't really, music, the diffusion of that kind of what they refer to as social capital. Secondly, I mean, even more oddly, there's a growing literature, even right now, specifically within political science, that migrants, and it's really bizarre, migrants go to their countries where they stay, whether and usually temporarily, in other contexts on a long-term basis, and they bring home democracy. So migration and remittances are a form of democracy. And the idea is that by having more money, they will be able to have the resources to overthrow their governments back home. And the perspective is that, yes, by extension, that these governments are authoritarian. They don't even look at the governments in which they go to in terms of the destination states. Well, I think this is a form of imperialism to a very high degree. But I think the entire process, the economic process, the cultural process, the political process, and the entire undermining of the existence and the lives of people in origin countries who make up, 70, 80% of the population of the world is undermined, and the new form, this development is the new form of imperialism, both economic, cultural, political, and so forth and so on. I'll just start there because I don't want to take up too much time.
Thank you so much, Manny. Raul, we can turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to express my gratitude to you, Jennifer, for inviting me to this critical theory workshop, but also, of course, to Manny for inviting me also to participate in this dialogue, the exchange motivated by his book, recently published book. In this first comment, this first response, I'd like to draw some parallelism and differences between Manny's argument in the book and my own developments in the field of migration and development. My work in this field over the last 3 decades has focused on developing a counter-hegemonic or Southern, I also call it Southern, perspective and action research agenda in the field. As you may know, I come from the critical Latin American school of thought, and much more specifically from Marxist dependency theory. This is the theoretical political ground in which I will base my comment. The first thing I want to emphasize is that the book is undoubtedly an important and timely contribution to an increasingly important issue for understanding contemporary capitalism and imperialism. The view that migration contributes to the development of the migrant-sending countries, which is at the center of the hegemonic, dominant or northern position in the field, is thoroughly and forcefully demystified and criticized throughout the book. I could add some additional arguments and empirical data, demystifying indicators based on my own research to support Manny's critique, but I would like to focus my comments on other issues. The relationship between migration and imperialism, the topic imperialism that Manny has done extensive work addressed in the book, is a very important contribution. However, it seems to me that there are fundamental questions about this relationship that go beyond remittances and the hegemonic position, that require a broader, deeper conception of the migration development nexus. To develop my argument, I would like to comment on three critical issues. The first one is the foundations of a Marxist theory of migration. The second is the theoretical political battleground and the emergence of this counter-hegemonic perspective. And the third point that I want to also address is what I conceptualize as the export of labor power and the emergence of new and extreme modalities of unequal exchange. This, as I will argue, is fundamental to understanding the imperialist strategy underlying neoliberalism. In Capital, going to the first point, the foundation of a Marxist theory of migration, in Capital, Marx introduces two categories that are fundamental to the analysis of migration under capitalism. The first one has to do with the genesis and nature of capitalist relations. This category is characterized by Marx as primitive accumulation, which implies the separation of direct producers from their means of production and subsistence. This turns labor into a commodity. This process of dispossession of direct producers, as David Harvey points out, is not only present in the genesis of capitalism, but becomes a permanent process along the development of capitalism, accentuated by neoliberalism, which he characterizes as accumulation by dispossession. This process has thrown many into unemployment, forced the unprecedented growth of informal economy, and led to a sharp increase in the volume and modalities of forced migration. The second category that I think is fundamental refers to the formation of a reserve army of surplus labor, which stands as a fundamental condition of capitalist development. By developing the forces of production and creating its own technical mode of production, the growth of capital and consequently capital accumulation cease to depend on the growth of population. On the contrary, the dynamics of capital accumulation generates an oversupply of labor, always greater than the real demand. By creating a redundant or surplus population, capital ensures permanent access to exploitable human resources beyond the dynamics of demographic reproduction. This, according to Marx, is the law of population that is peculiar to the capitalist mode of production. This law, in turn, is part of the general, and this is very, very important. This law is part of the general law of capital accumulations formulated by Marx in chapter 25 of the first volume of Capital, which synthesizes some of the main contradictions of the capital accumulation process. What this law states is that as capital advances, the concentration of and centralization of capital increases, and with it, the reserve army of labor also increases. And this is, I think, what I'm going to say now is, I think, very, very important for understanding migration. In dealing with this phenomenon on the phenomenon of international migration, it is necessary to move to a lower level of abstraction, considering the geographical asymmetric relations that characterize the process of accumulation on a world scale. In considering the center, and now I'm going to dependency theory. In considering the center periphery, the north-south, the development and the development divide, it is necessary to move from the more abstract level at which the law is formulated, capital in general, by Marx, to an intermediate level at which the structural differences between the two poles of the system are taken into consideration and taken into account. This implies an unequal and seemingly contradictory functioning of the general law of capital accumulation, where the countries and regions that concentrate and centralize capital and wealth are structurally different from and opposed to those where the reserve army of surplus labor is mainly located and concentrated. Under these circumstances, migration acts as a compensatory mechanism to correct this imbalance. This leads us to the developments in Marxist further to Marx that are essential for understanding the dynamics of migration. Developments and their dialectical interrelationship based on developments in the theory of imperialism, and more specifically, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Marxist theory of dependency. Here we can say many authors like Marini, also people that were not from Latin America, like Samir Amin, or the very close to this school, Monday Review scholars. No? Another fundamental issue has been to critically review and reframe aspects of this theory in the light of contemporary capitalism. That is something that Manny also looks in his book. This has been fundamental in reconstructing a counter-hegemonic perspective in the field. In this regard, we have introduced other key analytical categories, such as unequal exchange, category also considered in the book, with emphasis on Emanuel and Zach Cope. I believe we should go further in the analysis of unequal exchange, considering the emergence of a new international division of labor between the center and the periphery of the world capitalist system. Another category that is fundamental is monopoly capital, which is a central category in contemporary capitalism, to the point that Samir Amin, for example, refers to contemporary capitalism and neoliberalism as the era of generalized monopolies. The other categories that are important is the development of productive forces and the concept that Marx of general intellect. These categories are fundamental for unraveling the rentier nature of the development of the productive forces in contemporary capitalism and imperialism, and its relation to the nature and dynamics of contemporary south-north skilled migration. I won't have enough time to develop this point, but I just wanted to point out this issue. And another point that I will say a little more is the direct, indirect, or disembodied export of labor power, which I believe is crucial to understand the emergence of a new international division of labor between labor-intensive activities that are displaced to the periphery and knowledge-intensive activities that are reserved to the main imperial powers. Capitalism in the periphery is a historical process that was born with the advent of capitalism itself. From its origins, it has been linked to colonial domination through relations of plunder, and subsequently to imperialist domination through multiple and renewed relations of unequal exchange. Marxist dependency theory was developed in a historical context marked by the failure of the import substitution strategy as a path to industrialization in Latin America. The emergence of neoliberalism as a new strategy of imperialist domination has generated new and extreme modalities of unequal exchange and posed new challenges that are fundamental to the discussion of contemporary migration and its dialectical relationship with development. Let me now say a few words regarding the theoretical and political battleground in which the migration-development nexus has been debated. This debate has taken place on several interrelated fronts or battlegrounds in which I have been actively involved. The political sphere, particularly in the context of migration governance, the Global Forum of Migration and Development, the Global Compact, which is also referred in the book. Also in the academic sphere, but also in the sphere of social movements. Here we can talk about resistance from below. And here I have been part of the group that organized the World Social Forum on Migration, in which we have been discussing these issues. Also, People's Global Action on Migration and Development, and the Global Coalition on Migration, just to mention a few spaces of resistance and social movements. The mainstream or hegemonic position is supported by the doctrine of national security. The criminalization of migrants, this is also discussed in the book, is a crucial component of this doctrine, establishing as a right of states the creation of narrow channels of legal migration, far below the needs of the labor market. Under this position, illegal migration becomes actually a state policy. Corporate-driven public policies are also privileged, leading to the sanctification, as also is discussed in the book, of temporary worker programs. This position is dominated by the sacrosanct belief that migration contributes to the development of countries of origin, mainly through remittances, leading to what has been regarded as the remittances myth or mantra. This position, promoted by the World Bank, fits into the prevailing mythology of migrants as public enemies and hidden their fundamental economic, social, and cultural contributions to the destination countries. In contrast with this dominant position, the counter-hegemonic perspective, also known as a Southern perspective, is based on the doctrine of human security and places human rights at the center. It also seeks to make visible the significant contributions of migrants to destination countries. It focuses on the root causes of migration, and especially the structural root causes of migration, analyzing, among other things, social inequalities and asymmetries between countries and regions. While the mainstream perspective focuses only on a one-way relationship between migration and development, from a decontextualized, ahistorical, reductionist, and one-sided standpoint, the counter-hegemonic position seeks to contextualize and cover the full spectrum of dialectical relationships in the field of migration and development. It also considers the multiple impacts along the countries of origin, transit, and destination, and includes as key analytical dimension the analysis of human and labor rights violations suffered by migrants themselves and their families, as well as the root causes of the complex relationships underlying migration and development under neoliberal globalization. In this regard, moving to the third and the last point of this long comment, it is crucial, I think, to penetrate into and understand the nature of neoliberal restructuring. In this line, it is essential to understand the restructuring strategy undertaken by the large multinational corporations, taking into consideration that monopoly capital is a major driving force. By relocating part of their productive trade and services processes to peripheral areas in search of cheap and flexible labor and natural resources. In parentheses, the book refers to value chains, but does not elaborate on the important process taking place in peripheral economies. This is basically, in my opinion, a new nomadism in the global system of production, exchange, and distribution based on the enormous wage differentials that exist and are reproduced in the north-south horizon, the so-called global labor arbitrage, and the appropriation of ground rents from peripheral countries through what has been conceptualized as a new trend of extractivism fostered by the so-called commodity boom. Far from moving towards an export-led manufacturing platform, this process has led to what we conceptualize, and this is an important concept, as an indirect or disembodied export of labor power through the export-oriented assembly plants or maquiladoras installed in peripheral countries. Since these export-oriented platforms operate with imported inputs and tax exemption regimes, the substance of the exported manufactured goods is essentially the labor embedded in the production process. I have therefore conceptualized it as an indirect or disembodied export of labor power under the fetish of an export of manufactured goods, which resembles a new modality of enclave economy. This is closely related as a result of the imposition of the neoliberal structural adjustment programs to the emergence of a renewed trend of internal and international migration linked to the emergence of new and severe modalities of accumulation by dispossession. The direct export of labor power through international labor migration generated under these conditions is subject to conditions of extreme vulnerability. It should be noted that under the neoliberal ages, trade in all commodities except labor is being liberalized. This gives rise to a growing mass of illegal migration, which regardless of labor market demand, is subject to conditions of superexploitation, discrimination, and xenophobia. A situation that not only obscures the important contributions that migrants make to the economies and societies of destination countries, but also contributes to criminalizing them and turning them into public enemies, scapegoats of the neoliberal policies and the world capitalist crisis. This is also closely related to the emergence of a renewed trend towards extractivism and land grabbing. This trend is embedded in the current ecological crisis and has accentuated the dynamics of accumulation by dispossession in peripheral economies, fostering internal and international migration pressures. It is important to stress that extractivism does not imply a progressive path in the development of the productive forces, but a path marked by a shift in the primary source of extraordinary profits towards new indirect forms of rentier appropriation. One of the most striking features of the relationship between migration and development in contemporary capitalism and imperialism is the emergence of a new international division of labor based on the direct and indirect export of labor power, initially using low or relatively low skilled labor. I should add that this process is associated to the renewed trend towards extractivism and land grabbing, which in turn is linked to the rentier course followed by the development of the productive forces in contemporary capitalism under the command of the large multinational corporations and imperialist powers. This abandoning, and this is very important, the progressive mission of capitalism in this respect as originally was envisioned by Marx. The extraordinary dynamism of South-North skilled migration is part of this process. I think I will leave it here, my comment, and to start a kind of dialogue. But I really want to, I really enjoy reading your book, Manny.
Thank you so much, Raul. Manny, you wouldn't turn it over to you to respond if you'd like.
Thank you so much, Raul, for your comments. I thought they were very important and expanded on some of the themes of the book, and yet they also deepened some of the discussion with respect to the global economy, neoliberalism, and the dynamics of South-North relations. And this is crucial. I hope I think this is actually crucial in understanding migration, and I agree on just about everything you've put forward. And it is certainly within the school of thought of dependency theory, which I also embrace to a great degree. I suppose in the book I focused on the work specifically of Aguirre Emanuel, because he does deal with the question of unequal exchange from the 1960s to about 2000. And that's something that he pointed out, that this unequal exchange is rooted in the imbalance or the inequality of trade, which I think is crucial to understand the global economy today, that the value of work that is performed in the global South or by global South workers is subordinated significantly to that of the global North. And so I completely agree with that. And I also think it's crucial to understand this through the dynamic or the process of dialectical materialism, or dialectics in specifically. What is the relationship between the worker and the employer? And how does that transform itself over time? In my view, actually, migrants do not have the time in most instances to actually, this is a problem, to engage in class struggle, because they have to leave and they're under the thumb of an imperialist state. And that yet, okay, so if we're going to look at dialectical materialism, which is crucial to understanding the ways in which workers view the world, as you point out very clearly, it is through the material process, the ways in which the subjectivity of the migrant worker is informed directly by their working conditions, by their lives that are based on class struggles of various kinds. And in some respects, this is the case with respect to migrants who are undocumented in the West, in the United States in particular, who do not have who don't go back home for the most, to a large extent, forgive me, who do not go back home because they do not have the opportunity to do so on the same level as temporary workers. So I think that there is a disjuncture there. So, but there is, obviously a dialectic that occurs within the amongst temporary workers as well. I'd also, I think that rooting it within Marxist theory is what is essential. I don't know, I thought I referred to chapter 25, but maybe not. I focused on the third volume of Capital, in which examines how capital is extracted and how, the process in which capital is, the rural worker is actually expropriated by capitalists of all sorts. And in this way, I would even view some migrant workers as being the expropriators. You're certainly looking at it in a global perspective, and I think that's very important with respect to understanding the hegemonic relationships between different modalities, and you mentioned the accumulation by dispossession, and also go back to the ways in which the societies, the world, and so forth, especially in the global South, is ravaged as a consequence of capitalist accumulation in its contemporary form. And you point out the important role of multinational corporations as being significant to this process. And I agree. I would also add that those multinational corporations are in a specific location in the global context, and that location is in the global North. That location is in the imperialist countries, that it's the imperialist state and its multinational corporations that drive the oppression, exploitation of migrants, and that also, to a greater extent, undermine development in every possible way in the global South. And so, I agree. I'm just adding that point that I think it's a state process, that we can't divorce migration from states, and multinational capital is a process that is not just free flowing. It's something that emerges from the imperialist states. So I really agree on virtually every point. I think that you've really have a very long and prodigious you've done a long and prodigious work in terms of migration and creating social movements and so forth, or supporting social movements in the global South in a highly, one can say, significant way through multiple organizations. And I think that's something that needs to be examined further in terms of its efficacy, the degree to which migrants could actually have a role in changing the dynamic, I think is, unfortunately, from my perspective, highly limited because of the fact that they're either temporary or undocumented. And so I think absolutely, there's accumulation by dispossession. In this context, dispossession of the labor of most of the workers on the planet, uh, and um, and their entire livelihoods and so forth. And I would like to say very, very clearly that a fuller discussion of how this process of migration contributes to political economic change is very important, and how that change transforms itself into a praxis of some kind. And that can only be done, like I said, you pointed out, dialectically, without which we could have no purchase in terms of understanding how workers are engaged in the world and how are they have the capacity to resist. And from my perspective, well, I would say that there is a great level of inequality in terms of that. That resistance is very difficult, especially amongst migrant workers, and especially amongst, as you point out very, very clearly, the poor countries. I guess that's where the resistance must take place, in the global South, and we do need to relocate to the periphery, as you point out so eloquently in your comments. So there's a much more to say about this uh, context of migration and its inimical relationship to development, and also actually what I would argue underdevelopment, and I have argued the underdevelopment of societies by extracting the most educated, the brightest, and so forth. You made a very important distinction, which is absolutely true, that those people who are most highly skilled in poor countries, those people who are educated and so forth, are privileged in some respect. These are people who are actually important for the development of the global South, but they're sort of denied that right. And I think we can all agree to disagree with the international capitalists and multinational institutions and the states, imperialist states that back them up, that the argument that migration is a marginal force within society is untrue. I mean, if we take a look at, for instance, internal migration, it absolutely is not in places like China and India. With respect to international migration, it isn't either, because there are, something like 200, 250 international migrants. I think even those organizations that seek to advance the conditions of migrants actually do them a disservice by minimizing their role within society. So, for instance, the International Organization for Migration, which I think does a good job overall from a UN, perspective. They advance the notion that migrants don't really make up a large percentage of the global population, or do not make up a large percentage, but in terms of absolute numbers, they've increased, I think, probably more than 100% over the last 50 years or something like that. Anyway, I would like to thank you for your insightful comments and expanding the analysis. I think it would be very important to understand, to examine Marx's analysis of the dispossession that takes place, which I found in volume 3, but it's also in volume 1 of Capital to a great extent. It must be applied to this context. Not only does it hasn't, it's not a matter of must, it is absolutely relevant today as to even a greater degree than it was before. And just very briefly in terms of the International Division of Labor, that I think it's very clear, as you point out in your comments, that the Reserve Army of Labor is in the global South, and without which the global North could not advance itself. And by global North, I'm really referring to imperialism and Western imperialism. So I agree with you on on virtually every point that you make. I just would, for instance, emphasize the role of the imperialist state to perhaps maybe we both agree, but to a very great extent, and that imperialism is a major driver of this process of capitalist accumulation. I'll just stop there.
Thank you very much. There's a question that came in from the audience I can share, and then I also have a question or two, and you both should also feel free to respond to whatever has already been put on the table. But I did want to share this question from Stanislav Tomov, and it asks if you can comment on the European Union's structure as a structure of imperialist relations, and they're also between its core and its eastern periphery. And they were talking about recently looking at statistical data about Bulgarian exports and imports, and realized Bulgaria has turned into a colonial appendix to the large EU's core economies. So you both can feel free to comment in response to this.
I'm happy to start unless you would like to, Raul.
No, you please do, because you comment something in your book.
Yeah.
Regarding that.
Well, I consider Southeastern Europe to be a region of, broadly speaking, subordination within the global economy. This is something that has been advanced by Maxwell Lane in his work. I think it's very, very important to recognize that countries like Bulgaria, Moldova, Romania, and so forth and so on are undermined through the process of migration. Moldova is not a part of the European Union yet because many Moldovans are of Romanian origin, or at least call themselves Romanian. They can get certain kinds of European Union status as a consequence of it. That alone is something that we can talk about till the cows come home, because the European Union has its own form of migration that has excluded those people who are amongst the most oppressed, Africans, people from South, West, and Western Asia, as we've seen in the 2015 migration that took place and the way they were treated. Raul mentioned the role of transit states, which I think is significant in understanding this process. Of course, the European Union has the Schengen process and Schengen zone, and in that capacity, Europeans can migrate anywhere for the most part, and this has created a lot of rancor in the richest of those states, like Britain and so forth. Yet I would certainly say that the migration of Bulgarians, even Ukrainians, are people from that region, let's say, Moldovans, Romanians, and other people from the Slavic regions, as well as the Balkans and so forth, and even Eastern Europe creates a marginalization that does not develop those societies. So by that, I'm even referring to Poland, Slovakia, and so forth. I can go on.
Well, I want to add something. Following your first comment, and a few other things that might be interesting for this issue, for discussing this issue. Well, first, I think it's very, very important to value the contributions of migrants to destination country. And we have been doing, we have a lot of demystifying indicators to show this. In the last 15 years, the growth of the GDP in the US has been the contribution of migrants to the growth of the GDP in the last 15 years has been, I think, around 40% of the growth of the GDP in the US, the contribution of migrants. So these are very interesting figures that are based on the statistical data of the US that we have been doing. I've been discussing this in different fora, and also the contribution to the growth of the labor force in the US, of the migrants, to satisfy the labor needs is impressive. Around 45% of the growth in the last 15 years depends on migrants. But I want to add a few other points that I think are essential. One of the main arguments of the book is that it tries to go against the dominant position in the field, or the mainstream position. And that is very important, but I want to add a few other points. One is that I had a big discussion with Dilip Rath, by the way, the man that works remittances, in one of these global forums on migration and development. And what we did is try to, try to have another argument against remittances. And we posed the question, what is the cost of remittances? The cost of remittances. And Dilip Rath said, well, we are diminishing the transfer cost of remittances to the bank and whatever. And I say, well, we have to consider the reproduction costs of migrants and the educational costs of migrants too. And we did an estimation of all the period since NAFTA, from 1994 to present in the case of Mexico. And we compared that with the accumulated amount of remittances in a very conservative measure. And Mexico, the cost for Mexico and Mexican families and Mexican state, was double what we receive of remittances, doubles. So, and I did another argument that I said, well, if these people that are needed for the labor market were born and educated in the US, what could be the cost for the US? And it was 6 times more of what we receive in remittances. So the main issue is that this is not a north-south subsidy, but exactly the opposite. This is what we try to demonstrate. And also another, I think, interesting point regarding remittances is that they are a crucial element. I just finished an article of the transnational reproduction of the reserve army of labor. The reserve army of labor is transnationally reproduced, and remittances are a key component for this reproduction. And well, I have extensive data in several articles that I published recently. One is in critical sociology, it's just come out regarding this particular issue. And so another very, very important point has to do with high-skilled migration. I just finished a study that was published in one book regarding high-skilled migration, basically from Mexico, but also trying to understand how this is really working and operating. Mexico, for instance, has 1.6 million professionals abroad. It has more scientific and technological capacity abroad than in Mexico, given the PhDs and people with master degree. But what is very interesting is to see that there has been a structural change in innovation in the world. I studied in depth Silicon Valley, what I call Silicon Valley Imperial Innovation System. And most of the innovations come from the startups, and startups that are led by people, basically scientists from the South and from emerging countries, India, China. Well, in some days it's not in that category, but Mexico is in third place. And so this is quite interesting in the way that, for instance, patents in the US, 18% of the patents in the US were of foreigners in the 1960s. But today, 54% of the patents are for foreigners. So there is a huge dependence of the US in high-skilled migration, and mainly high-skilled migration from the South and from emerging countries. So this is very important because it changes and gives us some opportunities for social transformation, because it's changing, the type of dependency that we used to have, and we can take advantage of that for new transformation. And even to think about the South as developing, I would use another concept, an alternative modernity. That is not oriented towards profits, but basically to satisfy social needs and in harmony with nature. And this is something that we are starting to, or trying to do in the case of Mexico, to see how to restructure universities, take advantage of this capacity and orient this capacity to collectively look for different paths to tackle the structural problems of the country as a collective effort by universities, with a different orientation and focus on something that is very important, what is called social and solidarity economy, which is basically conformed, but not only, by the informal sector, which in the case of in the world, we have 60% of the population is in the informal sector worldwide. No? So this is a huge sector that is not attracted. The large multinational corporations are not focusing on this important sector, and this also gives us an opportunity for social transformation. And one point here is that we have to think in developing, transcending not only neoliberalism, but also capitalism. This is really the big challenge that we have at this point. So we are thinking on development, we have to think beyond this, because we are really facing the dangerous contradiction of capitalism. At this moment, what, for instance, John Bellamy Foster's called the epochal crisis, etc. Well, I just wanted to add a few things because I think we agree in almost everything, Manny, of these points.
Thank you so much, Raul. I'd like to share with you both a question. So the neoliberal restructuring of the economy through financialization and the globalization of production chains has had an enormous impact on organized labor. Manny, this is something you touch on in the book. Could you both discuss what you consider to be the most promising and effective organizing tactics for building workers' power among migrants and across working populations more generally?
It's a very difficult question. I guess I'm not sanguine about about migrants building power in their destinations because they, especially those that are undocumented, but including temporary migrants, because they're not allowed to stay there, or they're not recognized as really civilians or human beings in some respect, like in the United States. However, as Raul was pointing out before, that doesn't mean that migrants don't engage in struggle. Every single day, migrants are engaged in class struggles of one form or another, and there's absolutely no question about it. And I actually remember, dating me, 1996, New York, when Mexican indigenous workers were employed in the food and grocery, green grocers, we called them, at a fraction of the minimum wage, like one fifth of the minimum wage, which was already extremely low. So let's say 1/20th of the working class wage. And they engaged in some significant struggles, and they succeeded absolutely in establishing a new kind of labor regime in New York State. I actually was involved in it. I remember the protagonists and the union that was involved in it, or unions, but there was one particular one, the leader of which was from Chile, a mine worker from Chile. And while the workers were unable to organize into a union, they transformed the way the state enforced the minimum wage laws. So actually, at the time, it was the Attorney General Spitzer. Some of you may know that name, in a positive or negative way. But this was a positive thing, that he actually advanced a minimum wage for migrant workers, that every worker was entitled to minimum wage. So, you win that policy, but in terms of organizing, in terms of sustained workers' organizations, of course, they have their churches, they have various other kinds of organizations that people are involved in, and they go back home frequently, indigenous workers. And yet, it's because they go back home frequently, which is what I would do if I had the choice. They are unable to sustain long-term organizations, in my view. But that has nothing to do with their capacities to struggle. And therefore, my view on this is that I think that autonomous struggles are happening every single day, that one cannot deny autonomous organizing and so forth. But and let me say instead of that, but be positive. And I also think that will generally amount to nothing in the long term, because you need organization in order to advance class interests. And I think, obviously one can go back to Engels to recognize this concept, but yeah, there are forms of struggle going on all over. In many cases, I would say internal migration, there's a far greater capacity for workers to engage in struggle in places like India, and especially China, where we're finding tremendous forms of organizational activity. I'll just stop there. Hope I answered your question.
Well, I want to add something to this. Well, I think you are all totally right, no, about the weakness of the migrant organizations. No, throughout the world, there are some that are quite active, like Migrants for Nation, and others that. But all the efforts to build links with unions have not really progressed all over. No? That is something that is important. But I really believe that also, like, for instance, in the case of Mexico, let me give you some data. No? Mexico has 12 million migrants, no? in around the 12 million in the US. But the population of Mexican origin in the US is nearly 40 million, which is huge, huge, huge. So they can really build political power and other type of links. So there is something that could be work, and there are also, especially with migrant, sending countries that have more migrant tradition, could also organize it in this type of way. We in the World Social Forum that we organized in the 2019 in Mexico City, one of the main initiatives that we try to promote is to build an international network of sanctuary cities and spaces, to build up, to start moving from islands to something broader. And this also, I think, could be an interesting initiative, to move forward. This. And another thing is that migrants are not only the poorest and the lowest level in the labor. There is, of course, undocumented migration. Documented in Mexico is, for instance, half and half of the migrants, but there are, I think, many possibilities since migrants are all over the economy. They are, as mentioned in the book, also in health, but also like doctors and nurses. But in universities, they are one of the most important activities in innovation. They are critical, as I mentioned before. And almost in everything, since this new division of labor within knowledge-intensive activities, for instance, in the automobile sector, in which Mexico participates very importantly. There are many in Detroit. There are many Mexican engineers in Detroit working in what they call knowledge-intensive activities, but also like in Silicon Valley and other places. So we have to value all this important transformation and this dependency in the other way around of the destination countries on migrants. And this is going to grow because of the decline of the population decline in the US and Western Europe, which is even worse than the US. And the other interesting thing is that we have lost, in the case of Mexico, what they call the population bonus. If we had a population in working age, we are losing that. In the case of Mexico and most Latin America. And one of the things I remember we were discussing in Europe is that Africa is going to be the main immigration country in the world. And that is going to be a huge, huge problem for Europe if they are not really trying to deliberately contribute to the development of Africa. And they actually need that workforce, but they need it in a different way. Okay, just to want to.
No, thank you very much. I would I'd like to just ask one final question, if that's okay. Going back to something that you mentioned, Manny, in the very beginning, where you were talking about how undocumented migration is the preferred migration regime for the US. And I'd just like to ask you to both to speak about this and to address how how being undocumented creates political conditions that allow for the super exploitation of migrants.
Thanks, Jennifer, for that question. Well, as was pointed out also by Raul, undocumentation is a form, or the undocumented migration is a form of a regime. It's a regime of migration. And the United States, for the most part, but not exclusively, has decided that their regime will be undocumented migration, not documented in any way whatsoever, with the exception of highly skilled workers, some agricultural migrant workers, and so forth. And so as a consequence, it really allows capital to exploit workers, I mean, to a greater extent, because they have no rights to, very, very few rights to resist against employers. Of course, migrants have the right to organize into unions at a time when unions are not organizing really to any, in my view anyway, to any great degree in the United States and elsewhere. Of course, migrants have a right to resist and so forth, but employers have many more tools, for instance, to engage in legal mechanisms to deport migrants who are engaged in organizational activity. They can, whenever for instance, over the last 10 or 15 years, whenever migrants engaged in one form of organization or another, it would be usually the USCIS that would come in and arrest them and detain them and deport them on a regular basis. So employers, both large and small, can, on the moment's notice, even in sanctuary cities like New York, they could engage in this kind of really horrible activity of reporting anybody who's in the United States without documentation. So this is another problem in terms of organization that inhibits workers because I make the argument in the book, even if migrants may be doing a bit better in the United States than they would in their country of origin, especially very poor migrants, I don't think it's to any great degree. Perhaps over time that what they refer to, and I don't like the language of migration scholarship, immigrant incorporation and so forth. Yeah, that happens and so forth, but it doesn't happen at all for undocumented workers, period. They have no rights whatsoever. And we've seen this with respect to the DREAM Act and so forth, how undocumented young people, and now even going into middle-aged people, do not have the right to stay in the United States officially, although there are some states, such as California and New York State, that have better rules in terms of migrant laborers. So again, I'm not that sanguine, but I think that it's very difficult to organize in a country that doesn't organize in the first place. That's where I stop.
Well, let me add a few things. As I mentioned in my first commentary, undocumented migration is a conscious state policy of the U.S. It's totally. We have gone to analyze the policy in the U.S. of visas, not temporary and other types of visas. Only like I think 1/5 of the labor they need gets to the has a legal entry to the U.S. undocumented, and that is also discriminatory because they have special quotas for different countries. And they consciously are making Mexicans and Central Americans undocumented migrants, most of them. Of course, this is something that they consciously like to have the advantages of having a big mass of undocumented labor. Or because they pay taxes in the US, as you know. They are undocumented, but they don't receive social benefits. We made an estimation of that. And actually, in the US, they don't really know that we made an estimation of social benefits in the US of natives, no? How they benefit from immigrant and undocumented immigrant labor. No? For every dollar they pay of taxes, everyone, natives receive 1.4. I don't have exactly the figures here, but we did that estimate, like $1.4 of social benefits from every dollar they pay. Legal immigrants, for every dollar they pay, they receive like 60 cents of social benefits. And undocumented migrants which pay taxes, they only receive like 20% of from every dollar they pay 20% of indirect social benefits, not direct social benefits. So they are subsidizing Social Security in the US, and that is not recognized. So you go against migrants, they are just doing a kind of harakiri without knowing that. But basically, I think that's a conscious state policy in the case of the US, and also like in many European countries.
Thank you both so much for that response, and thank you so much for your presentations and all of your comments during this event. This has been such an interesting event and I'm really grateful for this book, Manny, and for the incredible work that both of you do, Manny and Raul. So I know that we're going to wrap up for now. I think there might be some lingering questions in the chat, but if it's okay with you, Manny, perhaps people can write to you. I know your information's online. And of course, just be sure to get this fantastic new book. And thank you both so much for being here today.
Thank you, and thank you, Raul, for being here too. I can't believe that you were in a conversation with Dili Brata. Shows you that you're a really easy person to get along with. Anyway,
Well,
thank you very much.
okay. Thank you. Okay.
Okay. I think so.